This isn't revision, it's restoration. This is blackwashed history. We carry the names, the songs, the truths they tried to erase, telling it like it really was, and still is. Where echoes of the past rise up with power, and every story we uncover is a step towards justice. So lean in, let the ancestors speak, and let the truth be heard. Only here on Blackwashed History.
I'm Brittany Wilkins, and this is Blackwashed History. This month marks the 101st birthday of Malcolm X. In past episodes, I talked about Malcolm X's speeches and also covered his personal reflections he left behind in his diary. Today's episode focuses on a different aspect of the man. It's not going to be the narrative most people have inherited, the street hustler, the thug, or the angry black man with a rifle, but who Malcolm was becoming on his life journey in search of liberation. Malcolm X said it plainly. The first aim of the AAFF will be to lay the groundwork to get the American Negro's case before the United Nations to make it an international issue. I want to take the whole Negro struggle to the Human Rights Commission of the UN and charge the United States with the same thing as South Africa and Portugal are charged with there. One more time for the listeners in the back. The first aim of the AAFF will be to lay the groundwork to get the American Negro's case before the United Nations to make it an international issue. I want to take the whole Negro struggle to the Human Rights Commission of the UN and charge the United States with the same thing as South Africa and Portugal are charged with there. So as you see, what Malcolm X was doing, he was no longer thinking on a local scale. He was beginning to operate on a more global scale. Not integration, not civil rights legislation passed inside American courtrooms and congressional chambers, and not just another seat at someone else's table. What Malcolm was doing was applying that international pressure, global accountability, America placed before the world and forced to answer for itself alongside the governments the world has already named as oppressors. And this shift from civil rights to human rights is the thing most people miss when they talk about Malcolm X. And it's the thing that made him the most dangerous to people in power. For many people, Malcolm exists frozen in a single image. You see him frozen with his sharp speeches, the Nation of Islam, his chapter with the Nation of Islam, his famous quote, "by any means necessary," plastered on posters, or even the brotherhood he had with Muhammad Ali, the photograph with him and Muhammad Ali, or his most famous photograph is with the rifle near the window. And all these images are real, but they are not the whole man. The Malcolm that worked governments the most was the one traveling, the one sitting across from heads of state in newly independent African nations, the one studying anti-colonial movements not as inspiration, but as a political framework, the one building relationships across Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, not as a tourist, not as a celebrity, but as someone constructing something much bigger. He was taking his mission and building alliances abroad, relationships that could carry the Black American struggle beyond the reach of American courts, American politics, and American control. So just to set a little bit of context, you have to understand what Africa represented in the 1960s to understand why all this mattered. This was not simply a continent recovering from colonialism. It was a contested territory. European empires were weakening, and new nations were developing themselves. Liberation movements were choosing sides in a cold world that never really asked them what they wanted. The Soviet Union and United States were competing for influence across the developing world, and every revolution, every leader, every emerging alliance carried geopolitical weight. So Malcolm stepped directly in that environment, and he wasn't naive about what he was doing. He understood that America's image mattered in the Cold War. The United States was positioning itself globally as the symbol of freedom and democracy, while Black Americans faced much segregation, violence, and systemic exclusion right here at home in the United States. So what Malcolm did was expose this contradiction internationally to audience who had their own reasons to hear it. And that made him something American intelligence couldn't afford to ignore. The book, Malcolm X, the CIA, and Other Blacks, it examines the surveillance and attention that followed Malcolm during this period. And it also introduces a man by the name of Leo Milas, a man who surfaced repeatedly in Malcolm's travels abroad and who moved through a lot of African liberation circles back then. He operated under multiple identities and whose political loyalties remain genuinely disputed among researchers and those who knew him. But what's documented is this. Malcolm X was operating inside an environment saturated with informants, people who had infiltrated his organization, competing ideologies, and Cold War maneuvering. And this environment was real, verifiable, and not theoretical. Now, where the full picture of who surrounded him and why gets a little bit murky, we say so. But the pattern itself is not in question. Serious movements that cross borders attract serious surveillance. And this is not paranoia, it's real, and that's history. By 1964 into 1965, Malcolm was not thinking the same way as he had back in 1959. He wasn't thinking only about Black Americans integrating into a system that excluded him. He was thinking about Africa, about colonialism surviving under new names, and what it would mean to bring the condition of Black Americans before the United Nations, where the United States would have to defend itself, not as a domestic matter, but really as a human rights violation. And this distinction is not small. Civil rights keeps the argument inside America, where America controls the terms. But human rights, it puts America on trial before a world that has its own memory of what Western power has done and continues to do. And Malcolm understood that shift in a way that made the conversation change completely. And that's the Malcolm people rarely discuss. And it's not because the information isn't available, but it really complicates the image we've been allowed to keep about Malcolm. The Nation of Islam version is easier to contain. The fiery brand he had. He was the counterpoint to King, the man who said what made comfortable people uncomfortable. That version doesn't require anyone to reckon with what he was actually constructing. But a Malcolm building international coalitions, studying frameworks, corresponding with African heads of state, and preparing to bring America before a global body of human rights charges. That Malcolm demands a different kind of attention and a different kind of accounting. So as I close out today's show, let me ask you this. What are you currently fighting for today? And if you're not getting the traction, consider the approach and pivot. Malcolm did. Thank you for listening to Blackwash History. If this episode shifted something for you, share it with someone willing to sit under the harder version of history. Follow, subscribe, and find more at Historians Connect. Until next time, the story is never over. It's just been interrupted.
Another chapter unveiled. This is Blackwashed History, not just stories of the past, but mirrors for the now. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to learn and remember their history. Until next time, stay bold, stay rooted, and never stop listening for the voices beneath the silence.